for this Global Food System Summit Dialogue. My name is Carol Boudreau, and I'm the Senior Land and Resource Governance Advisor at USAID. At AID, I support the design, development, and implementation of programs around the world that work to secure land rights. I also support efforts to create policies that reflect the really key role that land plays in promoting a whole variety of development objectives. So we appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to contribute to this important discussion. This dialogue is convened by the Land Portal Foundation to draw attention to the importance of land governance as a cross-cutting thread that needs to underpin the success of the summit's 5 action tracks. It's being presented in partnership with the European Commission, the ILC, Land Act, the Netherlands Land Academy, RVO, which is the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, GIZ, and Welthungerhilfe. So again, very warm welcome to you and a thanks to our conveners. Let's turn right to the issue now, though. Securing land rights is absolutely critical for realizing sustainable food systems that provide food security, that overcome poverty, and do these things in ways that do not unnecessarily harm the environment. Security of property rights is central to preserving livelihoods, to maintaining social stability, and to creating an enabling environment for really much needed investments. Those can be on-farm investments, they can be investments in human capital and training and more. It's also essential to support sustainably intensified and productive land uses. So as research and evidence demonstrates, secure land tenure provides farmers, women and men farmers, and we're going to ask folks to put themselves on mute while we're talking. So thank you so much for putting your mute on. Research, as we were saying, research and evidence demonstrates that secure land tenure provides farmers, both women and men, but as well Indigenous peoples, pastoralists, and others with the incentives they need to invest to improve their land, their soil, their capabilities. It can also help farmers increase access to financial services, to government programs, to social safety nets, and this is particularly important, we know, for women. Land rights, in fact, are a key to enabling poor women and men to exercise their fundamental right to be free from hunger and poverty, to live with dignity. And at the international level, we have frameworks that can help us achieve these goals, including the principles for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, as well as the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests. By the way, the voluntary guidelines 10-year anniversary coming up this coming May. These guidelines, these international frameworks have been developed to guide agricultural investments so that they contribute to rather than undermine food security. As the Food System Summit underscores, we need to recognize the essential importance of transforming food systems and food production to do 3 things. Feed the world's rising population and do this in a way that meets nutrition goals. Secondly, ensure decent livelihoods for those who produce our foods. And thirdly, decrease the emissions of greenhouse gases coming from agriculture and other related land uses. So we have to feed people, meet nutrition and livelihood needs, and do this in a more efficient and sustainable way to help protect the environment and address climate concerns. And these are really big asks. They're big challenges, but big challenges can also present big opportunities. We'll be exploring some of the challenges as well as the opportunities here today. So let me tell you how the dialogue is going to work. This dialogue will begin with a discussion among our very esteemed panelists. I will ask each panelist a few questions. This will be followed by 3 different breakout sessions. One is going to be focused on women's land rights, another on pastoral land rights and the commons, and a third on Indigenous land rights. You'll be invited in each of these sessions to share your concrete ideas for how we can achieve food security by enhancing land and property rights of these groups. The breakout sessions are going to last for 20 minutes, and you're free to join whichever group is of most interest to you. We will have facilitators in those sessions, and after 20 minutes, we'll come back to the plenary, and our colleagues who are facilitating those discussions are going to report back to us on what was discussed. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our panelists. Let me start first with Ms. Mina Susana Setra, who is an Indigenous woman leader from the Diakompang community of West Kalimantan, Indonesia. Mina is currently the deputy to the Secretary General of AMAN on social cultural affairs. AMAN, which is the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, Indonesia, has 2,422 Indigenous communities as active members. For 18 years now, Ms. Setra has worked on Indigenous issues locally, nationally, and internationally. David Kamwitz is manager of the Forest and Farm Facility, which is hosted by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the FAO. He previously served as a senior advisor to the Climate and Land Use Alliance and as senior consultant to the Latin American Regional Office of the FAO. He also directed the Ford Foundation's global work on natural resources and climate change and served as Director General of the Center for International Forestry Research, C4. Next, the Honorable Olyn Pratt, who is with us today. She's Commissioner of Land Use and Management with the Liberia Land Authority. Commissioner Pratt is an executive management professional and a certified urban planner with a specialization in urban infrastructure development. She has over 20 years experience in public and private sector institutions, both in the US and Liberia. And as one of the 5 commissioners of Liberia's newly legislated land agency, Commissioner Pratt is charged with the development of a national land use planning and management framework, which will be the first comprehensive land planning strategy developed in Liberia. Okay, and last but not least, Mr. João Carrillo is a researcher at OMR, a research center for rural and agricultural issues. He's also former Vice Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development in Mozambique from 2000 to 2005. Mr. Carrillo's background is in civil construction and agricultural development, and he holds a master's degree in remote sensing. He is currently a member of the National Land Policy Review Committee, and he is the panelist I'm going to turn to first. So, João, starting with you. Let's take a few minutes and you can describe for us the relationship between secure land tenure and food production in Mozambique. What is that relationship like? Over to you, João. And João, you may still be on mute.
I'm no longer in the ministry, yeah? And now I'm out of this and I'm a retired person. Most food in Mozambique is produced by smallholders in community lands managed under customary rules and customary norms. In Mozambique, above 95% of the food is produced by them. They occupy most of the land, but 95% of the holdings have less than 5 hectares. And these lands they occupy and produce food in, they are not registered. They are not formally registered. So rights on land and food production, you can see how close they are. Decisions on land use, especially what to produce and when, and the actual work is made mostly by women. And even when they have their names on the deeds, we know that women have less tenure security than men farmers. Current arrangements and legislation recognize customary occupation. There is a perception that they provide reasonable security of tenure, but there are increasing risks to this security. especially because there is increased demand for land from commercial, local, and global actors in the food system. There is increased activity to convert land from agriculture to other uses, and there is an expansion of cities and settlements or establishment of new ones. So I think that some form of formal recognition is needed, with particular attention to pre-urban areas, especially in Africa, where the rate of urbanization is one of the highest in the world. And we know that both formal and informal arrangements are incomplete, sometimes inconsistent, and facing uncertainty. Regularization processes are going on everywhere, including in Mozambique, but they have shown to be bureaucratic and centralized. In some places, they increase rather than decrease the risks of conflict, and hence the perception of tenure insecurity. For me, it is almost impossible to achieve sustainability without factoring in the political and ideological dimension. And we need to give space for this. For some, privatization is needed. For others, it may be less important than a clear and known tenure system. So the composition, organization, functioning, aims, and hidden issues, all these need to be brought to light to improve the food system worldwide. And this is how I would describe the situation and the relationship between land tenure rights and food production in Mozambique, Carol. Thank you.
Joao, thank you so much. And thanks for starting us by that focus on the critical role of smallholders in so many countries, the pressures that they're facing, and the need to think about processes to secure rights, whether it's through an improved registration process or otherwise, but also taking into account those political concerns. So great way to start us off. Thank you so much, Joao. And we'll come back to you in just a little bit. Meanwhile, let me now give the floor to Mina Setra. Mina, turning to you, with regard to land issues, what do you see as 2 or 3 big opportunities, or perhaps things that need to be done to support and promote sustainable intensification of agriculture for the indigenous peoples in Indonesia? Thank you so much, Mina. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol. Good evening, everyone from Indonesia. I think that for indigenous peoples, the most important things is ensuring indigenous peoples' rights on land and territories, because indigenous peoples have great contribution on protection of forests, biodiversity, nature, ecosystem. When land rights legally recognized, we can contribute even greater, including on ensuring sustainable agriculture, food security, and sovereignty. Guarantee access to develop traditional agriculture practices. Indigenous traditional agriculture has been so many years, so many times, scapegoat, as the cause of forest fires, which is unfair and untrue. So we need to have a guarantee on access to develop our traditional agriculture practices, because there are so many traditional knowledge in doing this traditional agriculture. And other things that is important, I think, is to develop roadmap on sustainable organic farming. We need to start changing our agriculture habit, which using so much chemical, into organic farming with clear target, using the roadmap that we can follow. And other things, it is really important to identify, to do documentations and recognize, as well as promoting and preserve local seeds. It is proven until today that local seeds have great resilience to the changing of climate. Local seeds also can help ensuring diversity of food that can contribute to healthy diet. And the last one is, I think it is really extremely important to support and strengthen the role of indigenous youth and women in this whole system. Yeah, we have a great examples in Indonesia with indigenous youth homecoming movement that basically call indigenous youth in the cities to return back to their communities to help to prevent and also manage their territories. And many of them coming back to their territories and develop sustainable agriculture with traditional, based on traditional knowledge. I think that's my point for now. Carol, back to you. Thank you.
Nina, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. So interesting to hear about the Indigenous Youth Homecoming movement. And I really appreciate you underscoring the importance of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous practices to achieve healthy diets and improve nutrition. So thank you so much for that. Ellen, we're going to turn to you now, and we're wondering if you can please share the context of land governance and food security in your country of Liberia. Over to you, Ellen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Carol. So in Liberia, 80% of our land is undeeded. It is mostly rural, customary land where poor residents make a living farming. Land in Liberia is the foundation and an economic asset for most people. And you can imagine the pressures we face as we endeavor to develop a sustainable and equitable land management agenda in a country where land governance has been plagued by corruption and fraud, and attempt to solve land conflicts by wielding cutlasses and machetes. As a country, we, like most developing nations, realize that agriculture is the surest way to lift our people out of poverty, reduce inequality, and with good governance, start to achieve our vision of a middle-income Liberia by 2030. Women comprise 80% of Liberia's rural agricultural labor force. Securing tenure rights for women is critical to strengthening food systems in the country. Recently, marches in support of equitable land rights. The Land Rights Law 28, also known as the Land Rights Act. For the first time in our nation's history, all Liberians have the opportunity to own land, including women. The LRA, by law, transfers the ownership of what was public land to the customary communities that have traditionally occupied those lands, with the allowance that each member of the community, that is both male and female, is allocated a portion of land for themselves. However, we see that there is a formidable disconnect between policy, implementation, and equality. Yes, the law enshrines support and rights, but how do we as a government ensure that it becomes a reality for the rural mother who represents 80% of the agricultural labor force and whose tenure insecurity is a persistent threat? The challenge for us is moving beyond policy to implementation of these and other changes that can fundamentally alter rural land tenure in Liberia and change the lives of women and girls and catalytically strengthen food systems. Securing land rights provides agricultural investors with the assurance needed as a for investments. The lack of this secure tenure has hampered agricultural investments in rural Liberia, and tenure rights could strengthen food systems if we are more aggressive in supporting customary communities to obtain their deeds. I think I will stop there, Carol, and turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Ellen, thank you so very much. And thanks for calling out the importance of women's land rights in Liberia, where you do have this really interesting and progressive new law, but does need implementation if you're going to help that 80% of the community or 80% of the agricultural laborers who are women. So thank you so much for your efforts. And we are now going to turn over to David. David, I know that your work has focused extensively on the Amazon region. Can you describe for us the importance of land tenure in the Amazon for sustainable food systems? Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Carol. And of course, the Forest and Farm Facility works in many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but I will be talking today about the 9 countries in the Amazon Basin. And first, I'm going to try to explain why the forests of the Amazon Basin are so important for food systems. Then, why the indigenous peoples and the Afro-descendant communities that live in those forests are so important to maintain the forests. And then finally, the role of land tenure and land tenure reforms in that context. The forests in the Amazon Basin produce huge amounts of water that goes into the sky and that provides rain for many of the surrounding areas, particularly to the south of the Amazon Basin and to the west of the Amazon Basin, which is so important for agriculture in those areas. Second, the trees in the Amazon Basin keep temperatures low, and those lower temperatures are fundamental for crop production, particularly soybean production, in much of the Brazilian, Cerrado, and southern Amazon, which is important for soybean production globally. Third, the biodiversity in these Amazon forests are very important for new medicinal plants, new types of medicines, the medicinal plants that people traditionally used, but also for producing new crop varieties of many crops where the wild relatives live, are based, or exist in those forests. And finally, the carbon emissions from these forests, if these forests were lost, would greatly contribute to global warming. So it's very important for both the local and the regional and the global farming systems that these Amazon forests remain. Now, what does that have to do with indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities? It turns out that about 1/3, maybe a bit more than 1/3 of all these forests are managed by indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities in the Amazon Basin. And the better forest that has more biodiversity and higher carbon densities, actually a much higher percentage is in the hands of these indigenous communities. And experience shows that these indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities have been very good guardians of these forests. They are much better preserved and have been lost. The deforestation and forest degradation rates have been much slower there. But nonetheless, the pressures on these forests are rising very quickly. People who are moving into them to expand agriculture, mining, logging, petroleum, drug trafficking. And unless these indigenous communities and Afro-descendant communities get stronger land rights, they won't be able to continue to protect those forests effectively. Many countries in the Amazon Basin have provided land rights. There is large areas that have been titled, but much more remains to be done. Not only to title these lands, but also to ensure that these titles are respected and that they are not titled areas are not illegally invaded, and to ensure that these indigenous communities have free, prior, and informed consent over investments so that governments are not giving logging concessions or mining concessions in indigenous territories that have already received their title. So in a nutshell, these forests are incredibly important for Latin America's agriculture. Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities manage a large percentage of those forests very well, but they will only be able to continue to do so if there's more land rights and stronger government support. Thank you.
David, thank you so much. Thanks for helping us connect the dots between why it's so critically important to protect forested areas and the critical ecosystems in the Amazon region if we're also interested in food security, as well as the really critical role that Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities play in that process. So thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to turn back to João. João, we've seen that the land rights of Indigenous peoples, smallholders, people in the Amazon, and farmers in Liberia, especially women, all of these groups play a critical role in providing food security. So João, regarding the issues you mentioned earlier, some of those challenges, what do you think needs to be done to address these? Over to you, João. João, if you can just unmute, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I always forget this. I was saying that, yes, it is important to have laws. Laws are very important to secure rights, but implementing them may be quite challenging. We have a reasonable law in Mozambique from '97, but we still lag in implementation. In my experience, grand plans usually also reflect grand frustration. So, but there are things that we can do, and I suggest that we should ensure tenure security to ensure food security. Monitoring of land use changes. We need to monitor land use changes. This implies obviously access to technological and human resources capable of doing that at an appropriate scale. Second, there need to be a linkage between land rights and limits of resource availability. The potential of the land need to be taken into consideration, and this implies a capacity for spatial planning to prevent losing land away from food production. This can be informal, this can be formal also, but the formal plans tend to be slow. They are not very flexible, and their reaction to dynamic of the situation and the uncertainty of the times is sometimes lagging, especially due to these institutional inertias. So bridging formal and informal procedures may help. Third, I think that monitoring the regularization process that is going on in various places to ensure that a bundle of rights is considered and that easements do not preclude rights. For instance, access to grazing and pasture land. Follow movements of resettlement associated with conflicts and weather or climate events. For instance, the conflict in the northern Mozambique displaced some 700,000 people from the place. And be prepared to intervene if needed. And also assessing the capacity to improve local level cadastre. Local level cadastre may be updated and may be trustful because they know the people there. Of course, this needs to be linked to a national cadastre, but decentralization of cadastre and registration processes, in my opinion, is very important. Finally, one of the best ways to secure land rights is by using the land. Using the land, you secure the land. And the secure land rights are of little advantage to produce food if this land cannot be used by the rights owner. The banks not always are prepared to accept land as a collateral, especially when there are poor creditors. So this implies access to information on, education for, and opportunities to assess finance, prices and markets for food production by the smallholders, by the small farmers, to produce, to process, And of course, even the consumption side of the equation need to be factored in. So if these people, so these are my suggestions, my 4 suggestions. So if we can do these and put the doors open either to enter or to exit the global food system, I think it is very important. Thank you, Carol.
Joao, thank you so much. You set out some challenges for us, and then you provided us with some really practical ideas for how to address these problems. And your point about local registries, very well taken, as well as your final point that farmers don't only need land, they need other inputs as well to build their capacity and enable them to enter into global markets. Thank you so much for that. All right, Mina, we're going to come back to you, and I'm going to ask you a question, actually 2 questions around that are related to climate change. So when it comes to addressing climate change and biodiversity, we know, as David mentioned just a moment ago, with increasing certainty that Indigenous peoples play a really critical role in protecting and conserving the ecosystems in which they live. And those efforts, they benefit all of us. Yet we see very different levels of political will to secure Indigenous lands and territories. We see some, but limited progress in other areas in terms of delivering titles. Even when laws and policies support these rights, that might get to the theme I'm hearing from many of you of having laws, but not necessarily implementing laws. And finally, there are serious problems in some areas protecting rights and preventing problems like illegal logging. So Mina, that was a long introduction. I have 2 questions for you. The first is, what practically should we be doing to make sure that the people who do so much to conserve the environment have stronger, secure rights over their territories? Question number 1. And question number 2, how would this effort contribute to stronger, more sustainable food systems? Mina, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carol. Based on our experience in Indonesia, we think it is important to provide evidence of our territories. We are often asked by governments or companies about the evidence that we are exist, like if you are Indigenous peoples, where is your territory? Where is it located? What is the data? Something like that. So it is important to provide evidence on this. In Indonesia, we do mapping of Indigenous territories. That is one of our strategies. Today, we have mapped 12.2 million hectares of Indigenous peoples' territories, including documenting of social data which go along with the map. It is important to get the information. We have hand over these maps to government so they can use this to accelerate the recognition of Indigenous territories. Recognition of Indigenous territories can ensure Indigenous peoples have full access to manage their territories, including their food productions. And if managed sustainably, it is also has a high economic value. In 2018, Aman, with 3 prominent universities in Indonesia, we conducted studies on the economic valuation from Indigenous territories in 6 communities. And the results show that economic value in one community only, it's bigger than the gross regional domestic product, which is really surprising. And this is not include yet the carbon from Indigenous territories. Other evidence that is important, I think, is our traditional knowledge on agriculture systems. It is important to document this. Yeah, we have so many examples of this agriculture system, traditional knowledge, like Subak Padi Field System in Bali, for example, or Lingko system. It is a spiderweb paddy field system in Manggarai, NTT, for example. You can Google it if you want. Including the traditional knowledge on storage system, like livelihoods system in all Kasepuhan community in West Java, and many other in other communities. regarding the food system, I have to also tell this information. In 2018, we did a study on the state of indigenous food system in Indonesia. And the result of the study has strengthened our preliminary assumption, actually, on the influence of global market demand to the changing of indigenous territories that has direct impact to indigenous food system. It provides simple but strong evidence by showing a comparisons on the situation of food diversity and availability in indigenous communities based on the condition of their territories. In conclusions, we think it is ensuring indigenous food sovereignty is the only way to protect indigenous food system. And food sovereignty can only be achieved if communities have full control over their land and territories. That's from me, Carol. Thank you.
Mina, thank you so much. And that was a powerful way to conclude that food sovereignty is really the only way to protect indigenous food systems, and food sovereignty really requires full control over land and territories. Thank you. Thank you for that so much. All right, Ellen, I'm going to come back to you. You underscored for us the really critical role that women play as food producers and in turn to feed their families. Have we done enough, do you think, to ensure that women have secure access to and control over the land that they depend upon to raise crops, keep livestock, or harvest wild food? And what do you see as the major impediments that women continue to face? So I'm asking you a three-part question. So are we doing enough? What are the big impediments? And number three, how are you addressing this issue? Ellen, I'll turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Karen. So that's a provocative question. Are we doing enough? We are getting there. While the LRA is on the books, it is actually not being implemented to the fullest. Sufficient awareness has not happened around women's land rights. And while the LLA has the potential to strengthen the voice of women and to give women a platform, it's only as good as the knowledge of the people that it impacts. I need to do more to build the capacity of women in order to help them to understand how this can change their lives for the better. We need to advocate for and actually give them the support they need to argue these rights. On the contrary, a lot of Liberian women know there is a new law, but that is the extent of their involvement with any policy discussions. They don't feel they have the intellectual capacity to be at the table. In Liberia, the literacy rate in areas for women is 23%. So a lot of our women cannot read or write, and they do not feel they have skills to actually dialogue on these issues. So we need to do more to secure their rights. They are the major agricultural laborers and feeding their families on the land they farm. Food security is practically linked to tenure security, and the gaps need to be closed with advocacy, policy, and fit-for-purpose solutions. Our challenge is we have inherited a very patrilineal society where women continue to be marginalized. So we understand what the challenges are and work actively to address those through education, awareness, advocacy, and support. Thank you, Carol.
Ellen, thank you indeed so much for that. Really appreciate your thoughts there and what you are doing with the LLA in your country to address those challenges. David, I'll come back to you. We mentioned this earlier. We know that youth are going to play and need to play a major role in transitioning food systems. So from your perspective, what needs to be done with respect to land or land rights and tenure issues to bring more young women and men into the agriculture sector as either farmers or as innovators and agro-entrepreneurs? David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carol. One thing maybe I didn't emphasize enough in the last question was that there is actually a lot of evidence that shows that land rights for these indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities does reduce forest loss and forest degradation. But another thing that's very important that we've also seen in the evidence to reduce forest loss and forest degradation is traditional knowledge, is cultural identity, is the cultural norms and practices of these indigenous communities. The reason why the fact that they're indigenous or Afro-descendant in forested areas is so important is because they have a series of traditions, a very strong knowledge and relationship to the forest that can easily be lost when you go from one generation to another. You can lose that and it could stay just with the elders and not be passed down by women to the next generation of youth and really embraced by young people. And to get it to be embraced, we need a number of things. One, we need to empower. I don't really like the word empower, but we need to recognize the importance of these young people in the process. And we need to promote gender equity, given the strong role of women as kind of the guardians of much of this traditional knowledge. And we need to have educational systems that really support this traditional knowledge and cultural identity and don't undermine it by making people believe that these things are not important, that they should be going off and doing something else. And then finally, we need to build economic alternatives that are based on this traditional knowledge, that allow people to turn it into something that's valued by the rest of society and can help them make a living, whether that be learning about forest monitoring for some project, whether it be ecotourism, whether it be handicrafts, whether it be multiple different options that allow you to convert traditional knowledge into something that young people can see will bring them both income and status. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your thinking. I want to thank David, Ellen, Nina, and Joao for this really wonderful and wide-ranging discussion. As I was listening, some common themes that I heard were the essentialness of protecting the producers and the stewards, the producers of our food, the stewards of these resources, as well as their knowledge in their cultures, the requirement to really close the implementation gap between law and to enable people to exercise their rights, and finally to provide the additional support that's needed for people to succeed. So that's what I'm taking away from this conversation so far. But now we want to give you the opportunity to share your views on what else needs to be done, or what we got right, what we maybe need to tweak a little bit. So as mentioned before, now we're going to go into 3 breakout sessions for 20 minutes. We're right on time, so this is great. You can choose which one of the 3 sessions you'd like to join. One will be focused on women's land rights. One will be focused on the commons and pastoral land issues. I want to note that we didn't spend much time talking about, really much at all, talking about pastoral land issues, but this is such an important issue in many parts of the world. And so we encourage you, if that's an interest of yours, to please join that group and weigh in. And then finally, we'll have a session on Indigenous land rights. I'll say that the session on women's land rights will be led by Christina Timponi Cambiaggi from the International Land Coalition. The session on commons and pastoralism will be led by Constanza von Olpen from the German organization Welthungerhilfe. She will facilitate along with Reta Menberu for the Land for Life project from Ethiopia. And then the session on Indigenous land rights will be led by Gemma Betsinga from RVO in the Netherlands. Okay, these sessions are going to start switch the order that I had planned. And Constanza, if we can impose upon you, why don't we start with you and hear the readout from the pastoralist group, and then we'll turn back to Gemma. So Constanza, over to you.
Okay, I actually, Reta, my colleague Reta and I decided to share roles. So Reta, you want to kick off and then I add.
Perfect. Yeah. Excuse me, Reta, of course, over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me? Great.
Yes,
So,
works
yeah.
well, Retta.
All right, thanks. So let me start with what Edmund mentioned as the way forward, one of the way forward. They are piloting, Edmund is an Irish farmer. They are piloting what they call decentralized autonomous organization, akin to the cooperatives for smallholders, whereby livestock are given unique IDs or sequencers, he calls them, and land is also digitized for payments for livestock grazing. So addressing both issues of securing land rights as well as translating it into some food security elements there. So this kind of empowers the pastoralist communities to advocate for their land rights and access to some grazing of land. That's one way forward. The other one is from Dr. Waktole, working with USAID on pastoralist land rights section. In addition to empowering communities at the grassroots, he suggests that we should work across the whole system, both at the policy and governance levels, and also at the operational levels. Some good policies get lost on the way, never getting implemented, in line with what the experience we had about women's rights from Liberia. So we might have good laws, but they don't get translated or implemented. So working across those levels of policy, implementation, and also empowering communities will be a kind of a comprehensive solution. And then the other one was from the African Development Bank, Mariale, on land governance specialist. Her suggestion was that mainstreaming is a key on securing land rights, so that those rights are read along with other investment areas. She also talked about issues of other rights for pastoralists, rights of passage or routes, rights to water, what we call as the bundle of rights collectively together. So mainstreaming is an element or the way to emphasize. And the other one is from Faye Alube from Kenya Land Rights. She has quite a number of challenges faced by the pastoralist communities in Kenya, but she emphasized a couple of issues at the way forward. Number one is the appreciation of the pastoralist way of life, the pastoralist economy by the duty bearers and others working on land governance. So there is diversity and complexity there. So understanding that is critical. On the other hand, on the demand side, raising the awareness of the pastoralists about the governance system, the land governance system, so that they can exploit it to the fullest. That was also a recommendation she made. And then finally, a South African experience, I guess, by Michael Barry about ensuring that pastoralists have the information on complex land governance issues and they are aware what their entitlements are and what they are defending or asking, and also having a long-term view, recognizing the complexity of tenure issues. He mentioned 100 years view on issues of entitlements. I think, and also having a clear evidence to defend entitlements. That has been also a challenge, I guess he mentioned in Canada. So let me stop there. Those are some of the issues I have captured. Over to you, Constance.
No, I think that was very well reiterated and very well captured, Retta, from our conversation. What was really coming up strongly, I think, was the focus on awareness, raising awareness among pastoralists, then the bundle of rights, the complexity of pastoral land rights, and that those need to be recognized in land governance systems. and acknowledged in those systems. And the issue also of mainstreaming land rights into other programs. I think these were some of the key recommendations coming up from the group.
Rita and Constance, thank you so much. Really interesting discussion on pastoralism. Appreciate your facilitation of that conversation. Hema, let's turn over to you. You were in the Indigenous Peoples group. Let's hear a readout from your group, please.
Yeah, sure. And I was a little bit late in joining my group, actually, so we didn't have too much time. Yeah, we focused on Indigenous peoples' land rights, and we tried to identify concrete ideas of how to improve the land rights and also turn that into food security. I also mentioned to the group that as a group we were kind of spoiled with a very good introduction by some of the panelists into some of the issues relating to Indigenous peoples and land rights. And I think we had an interesting discussion. Experiences were shared from Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Sierra Leone. And it was stressed, for example, that it's important to understand the underlying revenue system for Indigenous communities. There might be underlying sources of revenue that we don't see directly in the case of Indigenous communities. And something else that was mentioned by a contribution from Sierra Leone is also the role of civil society to organize themselves. And then linked to that, the importance of multi-sector approach in targeting the challenges around Indigenous communities, the challenges that they face towards land rights. There was a discussion also a little bit on whether it helps to talk about Indigenous people separately or rather also talk about local communities, since the challenges that they face are similar. And I think I'll just leave it to the panel to also reflect on that, because I think there's a bigger discussion about those issues also ongoing in the field. And maybe, to close, that was interesting. FAO shared some of their experiences in starting working on the legal side first as kind of a basis to build on to strengthen the rights of Indigenous people. So they shared some of their experiences working in the Mekong region and working with the governments to work on the legal framework for this. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I hope I reflected our discussions well.
Emma, thank you so much. Really appreciate hearing what you had to talk about. Such an interesting issue. All right, last but not least, Christina, we're going to turn over to you. You were leading the Women's Land Rights group, and women play such an important role in promoting and securing food for their families. What are the insights and concrete actions that people suggested in your session?
Thank you, Carol. Elise, she kindly volunteered to be the note taker and also to report back to plenary. So Elise, please, thank you so much for doing this great job of taking notes. Just a small observation. Our group was had a high participation of men who contributed to the discussions. This was very interesting. So Elise, please, you have the floor.
Okay, so I'll just basically read from my notes, but basically one of the I think one of the points made was that in sequence what needs to be addressed is the issue of access to land, then ownership of land, and third, the control of the land and its use. There was another point made about clearly defining the property rights of women, as well as involving the traditional leadership for any kind of durable and sustainable solutions. Multiple points on awareness raising and information to address not only the cultural biases, but also to inform on the legal rights and on the services available. that was including even, the type of land transaction types that are made available, and more empowerment programs for women in different areas. I would say perhaps also for the communities at large, and when it comes to patriarchal customs. Then some modalities specific to women to be thought about, such as flexible payments modalities for the land, and also building links between, access to justice and the recognition of rights. So, having so that the rule of law is actually implemented and implementable. There was also an interesting point made from cultural anthropologists. So it was about positive reinforcement or using positive variant type of success stories from women to raise awareness and inform, I guess. So there was other points made about addressing social and gender norms and engaging with private sector. These were not verbally made, but they were points given in writing. And so this was all pertaining to the first question, and only one point made on the question 2, which is, what's the impact on the food security and nutrition? So obviously increased access to credit to women through rural financial services. If you have land rights, this helps. And, it also allows for leasing agreements to be put in place. So a land that's not used by a particular female-headed household can become a source of income. So these were points raised, and yeah, time was too short.
Carol, can I just add one thing that was not really discussed in our group, but I think is important also for us to think about, is that we've been addressing in the discussion women rights as an individual right, as property, land property rights. But when it comes to community, where you have a situation of common lands, many of women are taken away from the spaces of decision making. So I think this is also important to have in mind, that women should, for cultural barriers or something like that, but women should be included in the decision-making process of the collective decisions, so she can also give her voice and make part of the decision-making process when it comes to the community level. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Christina and Elise, thank you both so much. And we have about 6 minutes left according to my clock. So we're going to start our wrap up now. And I want to start that wrap up by reminding all of you that the aim of this dialogue is to provide concrete recommendations that feed right into the Food Systems Summit. The summit is taking place on September 23rd in New York. And our conveners today will be submitting feedback through the official feedback form. But we know that we need to do more than this if we want the summit to address the challenge of land insecurity. And I think we've heard in so many different ways today that this is a problem for so many people, a problem that they face each day in their lives, whether they're farmers, pastoralists, forest dwellers. Many people, likely hundreds of millions of people, face this insecurity on a daily basis. So today's session can send an important message. We've heard from government representatives, we've heard from people at UN agencies, we've heard from civil society, and we've heard from people working in Indigenous peoples organizations. We've also, though, heard from you about the serious problems that insecurity creates, how it directly impacts livelihoods, communities, our ability to feed the world in a sustainable manner, and how it can impact the environment and contribute to climate change. So let's see this dialogue as a call to the Food Systems Summit and to the UN General Assembly to put this issue at the center of its ambitious agenda. not to sideline land rights and land governance, but to really center an equitable, sustainable transformation of food systems on the rights of women and men to the land they depend upon for their lives, their livelihoods, their cultural heritage, and more. Let me also take a moment to point out that there is an active global conversation and work that's being done among donors, civil society, the private sector, and other actors to promote good land governance. And this includes developing a multi-stakeholder global land agenda and a framework for action. So this is all exciting. Those of you who are in this meeting, you understand how critical this issue is. Let's try to raise this issue up. It's not one of the action tracks at the summit, but needs to be woven through all the different action tracks. And so hopefully our efforts today can contribute to that. With just a few moments left, I think we're going to do a lightning round and then we'll close out. So my lightning round for our panelists today is, let's hear if you have a message you'd like to share with the Food Systems Summit. David, I'm going to start with you. What's the message you'd like to convey to the folks at the Food Systems Summit? And very brief.
Very briefly, the message is that land tenure security, communal land tenure security for Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, traditional communities, can reduce deforestation, and that can have a global impact on the food system in a very positive way.
David, thank you so much. Joao, let's turn to you. Quick message.
My quick message is that when the land rights are secure, we can dream of food security.
That is a great short message. I love that message. Thank you so much. Mina, how about you?
What I want to say, they already say it. But I think, again, to strengthen again what I'm saying before, we truly believe that food sovereignty is the only way to protect indigenous food system, and indigenous food system can be the foundation also for food sovereignty in national level, and that can be only achieved if we have full control over our land and territories.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nina. And Commissioner Pratt, let us close the session with you.
Thank you. I think we know that across the world, women and girls parcel of food. I think we need to look at fit for purpose and fit for context solutions that address the issues, not just address the issues holistically, start to see a world where hunger is alleviated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I would like to extend my personal thanks to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us to talk about this important issue. It's been such a pleasure to spend time with all of our panelists and with all of you in the audience today. Remember, this is such an important issue. You have an opportunity to weigh in. We'll weigh in on your behalf. But in the meantime, please do reach out to appropriate folks in civil society or in your governments to let your opinions be known about the role land should play in sustainable and equitable food systems. So thank you all so much, and thanks particularly to the conveners today. Really appreciate the support around this issue. I wish you all a very good day or good evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the organizers and to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.